Hello, good afternoon or evening. I'm not quite sure where we are. It's all between the two. I'm Tamandra Harkness. I'm here to host and sort of interview our guest for this evening. So it's great to see you all here. And can I ask you to switch your mobile phones to silent, just in case any of you want to tweet. And also, we're live streaming the event. So welcome, I'm not sure which camera, welcome people who are watching live on the internet. If you want to turn around and wave, they're in that camera there. And anybody either here or on the internet, if you want to join in the conversation, there's a hashtag Pelican Books, so you can join us on Twitter. So that's all the boring bits out of the way. This is the third of 3 special events. Well, actually, maybe more than 3, but it's the third special event associated with the relaunch of Pelican Books, which is Penguin's iconic imprint, first launched in the 1930s with the mission of democratizing knowledge, bringing handy guides to deep, important subjects that are comprehensible to the general reader. And they were first advertised as these books are available for the price of a packet of cigarettes. Ironically, these days, probably cigarette manufacturers are the ones who would need to say, democratize cigarettes. You can buy these cigarettes for the price of a paperback book. But there's the change in times that we live in. So this is the third event, and I'm delighted to welcome our guest, Professor Bruce Hood. He's an award-winning psychologist. He's taught at both Harvard and Cambridge universities, so he has both sides of the Atlantic covered. And he's now the director of the Cognitive Development Centre at the University of Bristol. He delivered the Royal Institution Christmas Lectures in 2011. Some of you look young enough that you might have been in the audience for those. And he's written 2 previous books, The Self-Illusion and Supersense. But his new offering, The Domesticated Brain, which is one of the new Pelican series, brings together 2 topics that I'm very interested in, brain science and psychology, in one enormously dense and comprehensive book. The way the evening will run is Bruce has 15 minutes completely free range. I will then join him for a bit of a conversation, and then we will come out and bring the conversation certainly to you in the room, and possibly, by deft use of hashtags and Twitter, even some of you on the internet may get a look in. Keep your fingers crossed. But first, I'm going to clear out of the way and hand you over to Professor Bruce Hood.
Thank you. Thank you, Tamandra. That's very gracious and very pleased. I was delighted when Laura Stickney from Pelican approached me in 2012. They just seen the Christmas lectures and asked, well, could we translate the content of those lectures into a book which was accessible in the tradition of Pelican? And brain science is a vast area, so I had to really think about what I wanted to talk about. And for me, I think the remarkable thing about the human brain is its capacity for social engagement. It's a social brain in many ways. And it's the way that we can coexist and cooperate and live in communities and generate cultures, which I think is our defining feature. Now, of course, other animals live in groups as well, and indeed some primatologists would claim that there's culture in other animals, but nothing to the extent that we experience as humans. And so I really wanted to focus on the pro-social capabilities of humans. Now, this ability to communicate, of course, is uniquely human. Our language is something which you don't find in other animals. But I would argue that in the evolution of humans, before language appeared on the scene, we had to have brains which were capable of sharing ideas, brains which were receptive to living in groups. And so I think that must have predated the onset of language. And this is an idea that has been proposed by a number of thinkers, but I'm very much influenced by Mike Tomasello, who is the director of the Comparative Studies Max Planck unit in Leipzig. And Mike studies developmental psychology in young children, but he also does studies of primates and monkeys. And he's argued that our brain is really pretty much pre-adapted for social engagement and culture. And he quipped last year, I think he captures it beautifully. He was giving an interview on the Horizon program, which was made by Alice Roberts about human evolution. And he said that fish are born expecting water, but humans are born expecting culture. So this is really what the book is about. It's the pre-adaptations, the evidence that culture and pro-social behavior is very early, in many ways there before language appears, and the mechanisms which keep us being pro-social, mechanisms which enable us to integrate with each other, and most importantly, to avoid being excluded and ostracized. And in the book, I deal with the problems of ostracism and the effects that can have on your health. And at the end of the book, I deal with what I think is a potential epidemic of loneliness that we may be experiencing in the modern society. So the book is called The Domesticated Brain, and I got the inspiration for that title by reading an article that was a Discover magazine in 2010 by Kathleen McCulloch, in which she points out a really strange oddity of human evolution. And that is that since the end of the last ice age 20,000 years ago, the human brain has shrunk by about the size of a tennis ball, 10 to 15%. And that was an alarming fact. I don't know about you, but I wouldn't like to lose that amount of neural tissue. And so that's very odd, because that stands in stark contrast to the generally accepted view that over the course of human evolution, for the past 2 million years, the brain has been getting larger, as indeed has the brain of other animals which live in large social groups. In fact, there's a direct relationship between the size of the brain and the size of the social groups that animals live in. This is known as the social brain hypothesis and has been promoted by another Pelican author, who I can promote, which is, of course, Robin Dunbar. So this seems an odd fact to find the brain's been getting smaller. If you combine that with the fact that the population exploded at the end of the last ice age, we know that by an analysis of the mitochondrial DNA, that the human population increased in vast numbers, and we had to settle down into large groups. So why would a brain get smaller when we're settling in large groups? It just doesn't seem to make any sense. And in the article, a number of propositions are considered. But it was this notion of domesticity was the one that really captured me. The idea is that brains shrink as a byproduct when you become domesticated. Now, normally when you think about domestication, you think about all the features of living in modern society. But domestication has a much older and scientific precedence, most notably in the famous book On the Origin of Species by Darwin. And Darwin, of course, used the book to lay out his theory of natural selection, and it was based on his observations and his travels. But a lot of the argument was based on his discussion with breeders, animal breeders, who were domesticating the species by selecting those individuals with the desirable attributes and then breeding them together. And I've taken this quote from the last pages on the Origin of Species because, well, first of all, I think it's great to have a famous scientist like Darwin acknowledge the importance of psychology. Something I often have to battle with my colleagues. But he said that psychology will be based on a new foundation, that of the necessary acquirement of each mental power and capacity by gradation. Light will be thrown on man in his history. And what he's saying is that if you really want to understand humans, it's not enough just to know about their physical changes and the adaptations to physical environments. You have to understand the brain changing in addition to changing environments and the mind that creates. In other words, he's proposing evolutionary psychology. And I think what went on at the end of the last ice age was indeed the environment changed, it got warmer, but then living in large groups needed us to select for individuals who were better adapted, who were more pro-social. We had lived in groups before. Clearly, there's no question about that. But this rapid increase in population required individuals who were much more conducive to being amenable to others, getting on, communicating, cooperating. And I think that's what went on. So we were domesticating ourselves, choosing those individuals with these particular traits. Now, the idea that choosing traits for pro-social behavior would change your physiology is supported by the work of Dmitry Belyaev. In the 1950s, he was a geneticist working in Russia, and he introduced a domestic program into the otherwise wild Siberian silver fox. So these were animals which were trapped and then kept in the farms for their fur. And what Dmitry Belyaev did is that he selected those individual foxes who were more docile, less aggressive, didn't snarl when they were approached, and then bred them together. And he discovered that within about 12 generations, you could produce a completely domesticated animal. So they looked differently, so they had wagged their tails, and they had fluffy tails and floppy ears. They behaved differently. They were kind of almost like playful puppies. In fact, remember that puppies are domesticated wolves. And their physiology was changed, their temperaments were changed, and their brains had shrunk by about 10 to 15%. And indeed, if you look at all the animals which have been domesticated by man, they also have this similar brain reduction. So that's why I'm suggesting that possibly, as a consequence of selecting those individuals who are more pro-social, this is how we underwent this sudden and rapid change. Now, the human brain, of course, is incredibly adaptive. A newborn's brain is about a quarter the size of an adult's brain, But within the first couple of years, much of that difference is made up. And it's not because they're growing new brain cells. Babies have almost a full complement of brain cells. Rather, they're wiring up, because most of the brain is actually made up of connections. This is an image showing the major connections between the major processing areas of the brain. But if you go into the microcircuitry, if you go right down to the basic building blocks, this is an image of a neuron. These neurons communicate with each other, and they have vast numbers of connections, up to 10,000 each. And it's through the immense complexity of these interactions and signaling that we're able to store information. This is how the brain encodes representations of the external world. And indeed, it's important that you get experiences to form these connections, because if you don't have early experiences, these connections atrophy. So early experience can shape the brain. This is the process we call plasticity. Now, we know this from the work of Hubel and Wiesel, who studied this in the emergence of early visual processing, that if you raise animals in impoverished visual environments, their vision is damaged. But we're increasingly beginning to understand that the early environment also plays critical roles in social development. If you raise children in socially deprived environments, then this can have pronounced effects on their social development throughout life. So when you look at the brain, it has all these different processing areas, but we've been identifying areas which seem to make us capable of interacting and living with each other in very complex environments. And so here are some of the candidate structures. You don't really need to know the technical names of them, but I've identified 8 of them, and I've segregated them into 4 different categories. There are structures which are activated by, first of all, in the blue, detecting the presence of others, so areas which light up when you see faces or bodies, or indeed register biological movement, which is indicative of another human. You have areas which are activated when you're thinking about someone else, when you're imagining someone else's, what they must be thinking, or trying to take their perspective, what we call mentalizing. These are areas of the medial prefrontal cortex. And then there are areas, of course, which are activated by the emotions. A lot of the joys and the tears that we experience are often to do with social interactions that we have with other people. And so these are the areas of the amygdala and the insula. And finally, there's a system that's called, in general, the mirroring system, that seems to resonate or copy behaviors when we watch other people doing it. And this used to be thought to be a mechanism by which young children learn by observation. But I think actually probably a lot of the mimicry is used to signal our affiliation with people that we like. So we tend to mimic and copy those behaviors and mirror those behaviors of individuals that we want to be affiliated with. Now, all these structures are present in the very young baby, but they undergo change and development and refinement through social interaction, especially things like mentalizing, which probably doesn't really appear until around the child is about 3 to 4 years of age. If you think about our childhood, it's one of the longest of all animals on the planet. Now, I don't think that's to do with education. I think we've evolved long childhoods, and we are dependent on caregivers so that we become enculturated, so we can learn the rules about how to behave in social environments. If you think about it, parents are always telling their children to behave themselves. That's what it is. It's not really education, which is fairly recent in evolution. I think this is really a mechanism which allows us to become members of the tribe. So from the very beginning, there is this pre-adaptation. The babies are showing all the behaviors which are indicative of pro-social behavior. They will smile when they're smiled at, so they respond to early social interactions. They will copy behaviors. They will cry when they hear crying. And they will seek out others who seem to be mimicking and duplicating their behaviors as well, that seem to indicate that their attention is directed towards the child. And these are the most important people for very young babies. And in my second book, The Self-Illusion, I talked very much about how you have to develop a sense of self. And that's essential for social interactions. Before you can interact effectively or functionally with another individual, you have to be able to have a sense of your own identity. And that emerges over the course of childhood. The first thing to appear really is a sense of self-recognition. This is something which is uniquely found in social animals. For example, looking in the mirror and seeing your own image and knowing it's you. That's only found in humans. But it doesn't really appear until the second year of life, and not at all in animals which aren't social. Another aspect of who you are is your gender. Am I a boy or am I a girl? Or somewhere in between. And at this age, children are becoming aware of what are the characteristics, and they're reflecting and encoding all the cultural stereotypes that we associate with boys and girls. In fact, they're not just becoming gender detectives, they're becoming gender police, because they're saying, well, boys can do that and girls can't do this. So they're really quite rigid about these early markers. At 3 to 4 years of age, they acquire what we call a theory of mind. And this is the capacity to understand what someone else might be thinking, to appreciate that they have mental states. Because prior to that, very young children are egocentric. They assume that everybody knows what they know. So they find it difficult to take another person's perspective. And of course, this is an ability which is impaired in the condition of autism, which is why they find social interaction. One of the reasons they find social interaction is quite difficult. Self-esteem. They're starting to become aware and conscious of where they are in the pecking order, because up to that period in time, they've generally just been the center of attention for the parents. But when they start to interact with other children, they start to become very aware of where they are in the standing. And so you see the appearance of behaviors such as embarrassment, blushing, all these measures where you're taking into consideration how you might be thought of by others. Self-control. They have to be able to control and regulate their own behaviors in order to have social interactions. If you can't control your impulses or your anger, then you're not going to be much good in a social situation. And again, these are developmental changes that we see which we can link to the maturing brain structures. And then finally, autobiographical memory. Who am I? This is the awareness and the repertoire of memories and experiences that we can each recall when we think about our early childhoods. But it's interesting to note that hardly anyone has memories prior to their second or third birthday. And that's because I don't believe that the mechanisms are in place in which to encode this sense of identity. But once you have your identity, then you can set out in this social interaction, you can learn from the tribe, you can accumulate knowledge, and you can build upon it. And in the book, I describe the processes of interacting with others, what's considered appropriate behavior. And I want to just highlight a couple of them. Altruism and punishment I talk about. The way that children start to know who to help and how to share, the emergence of sharing behavior about 4 to 5 years of age. In addition to this pro-social behavior, of course, you also have retribution and revenge against individuals who are trying to be freeloaders or trying to take advantage of the social situation. And in the final part of the book, I really focus on the consequences of being isolated. What happens to you if you don't have a rich, fulfilling social interaction, social life? And it turns out that actually it's really a health risk. Now, this isn't in the book, but this is a recent study I found, and I don't know if you can see the data, but it's a meta-analysis, which is the gold standard for scientific reporting. If you want to know how strong an effect is, you do an analysis of all the studies which have looked at the effect, and you calculate what's called the effect size. And on the top 3 bars here, what we have here is a measure of loneliness and its relationship to morbidity. So this is a study of over 300,000 people over 7 years. And the long and the short of it is that if you have good social relationships, you're 50% more likely to survive over that period of time. And that makes it a greater health risk than obesity, lack of physical exercise, and indeed even moderate smoking. And so with that warning, I leave you. And I'd like to thank Laura and all those at Pelican for giving me this opportunity to talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. I think that gives you some idea of the enormous range of topics you cover in quite a compact little book, far more than you could certainly fit into a 15-minute talk. But I'm interested in the fact that although you're a psychologist, you do look to the brain for explanations for human behavior. Is that a long-term interest of yours?
Yeah, interestingly, I started off not really knowing anything about the brain, and some of my earliest studies were on pure cognitive development. So I was studying the classic work of Piaget and how babies come to understand and think about the world, the physical world. But then when I started my graduate studies, I began to work on the visual system with a group at Cambridge who came very much from the physiology tradition. And the thing about vision is we know a lot about it. We know a lot about the neural mechanisms of it because we share a visual system with many primates. And so they were able to do a lot of the invasive early physiology type studies. So we knew a lot about the brain mechanisms of how vision works. But in my work on vision, I started to understand and appreciate that you shouldn't draw a distinction between the sensation perceptions. It goes all the way up to cognition. So whilst psychology is typically to do with concepts, they must be substantiated to some extent, even in the brain, because they're nowhere else. Although, of course, you could always argue that concepts exist out there in society. So whilst I love the brain, I find the brain, explanation at the brain level insufficient unless you consider how a brain is operating in a sea of brains. And I find that the physiological focus helps me try to constrain the sort of explanations. And I think it's a useful way of doing so.
I was very interested in that this book, you seem to be trying to reconcile those two approaches by looking at the shrinking brain, which was a fascinating thing, the idea that actually somehow we need less brain power when we live in a complex society, whereas you might think we'd need more. Do you think that this is a way of kind of trying to reconcile your two ways of looking at the world? You think, oh, on the one hand, it all happens in this 3 pounds of matter in your skull, on the other hand, it's part of a complex culture that we live in. Do you think that your book somehow manages to find a mesh of those two approaches?
Well, to be honest, Mandra, the reason I started with the shrinking brain was the fact, first of all, that completely shocked me. I didn't realize that was happening, and I needed a hook to get readers interested, because there have been lots of books about the brain and psychology. And so that, to me, was the real wow factor. But then, of course, drawing a direct relationship between brain size and complexity is very naive, in the same way as saying that, computing power is equal to size. We know, for example, you look at computers in the 1950s, they'd occupy whole rooms, and now you have more processing power in your back pocket with your iPhone or a smartphone. And so size isn't everything. It's what you do with it, of course, which is the important thing, to quote somebody. And so for me, I think that the fact that our brains do not operate in isolation, the fact that culture builds upon all the knowledge which is passed on by ancestors is really an important component of it. What we do effectively is we learn from others. And so the processing power is not so much the intelligence or that we can bring to bear, but our access to all the information or the collective intelligence of everyone else that's been working. So brains never operate in isolation, certainly for humans at least, is what I was saying about it. But yes, there's a real tension, I think, by focusing only on the brain or focusing only on the psychology, you should try and integrate them. Because I think we know that the mind must be a product of the brain. So there must be a relationship somewhere. It's just very complex.
So having established that our shrinking brains reflect the way that culture, if you like, shapes us physically, would that be too far to go?
It is a speculation, I'll be honest. We don't really know why the brain has been getting smaller. I just had to start with something which I thought would grab you. There are a number of possible explanations. I do think it's strangely coincidental that domestication does lead to this change, and so that was really the platform which allowed me to talk about, well, what would be domestication in humans? What would be the behaviors that we selected for? So the book really covers all we know about social development in early childhood, and also the importance of that to be included in the group and the consequences of what happens when you're not. So I confess, I really don't know why the brain has been shrinking. And it may start to increase again, who knows? But it is a really intriguing oddity of human evolution.
Do you have a massive grant application in right now to find out why the brain is shrinking?
Yeah, I'm looking for a 10,000-year grant application, which will allow me to do longitudinal studies.
Is this a sneaky way? Because I know you are sympathetic to evolutionary psychology and the idea that... and the idea that a lot of human behaviour is very deeply embedded in our evolved structures. Is this a sneaky way to sidestep criticisms of evolutionary psychology and saying, well, of course, culture is important. Look, it's culture that has made us evolve to be the way we are now.
It's slightly sneaky, and of course, evolutionary psychology has a checkered history with just so stories. We don't have time machines that we can go back and check. But it doesn't mean that it's a pseudoscience. There are real important, verifiable predictions, and indeed, people who work in the field have have made great strides. In particular, Steve Pinker, I think, is probably the champion of evolutionary psychology. But yes, just so stories are not very useful in moving science forward, because you have to have testable hypotheses. That's the whole point of science. It has to be a premise that you can check out. But I also think that we are beginning to discover really interesting mechanisms by which the environment can turn on and off our biology. And this, of course, is the processes of epigenetics. Now, I don't want to hand wave and say, well, epigenetics will explain everything, because this, again, is another just so type of story. But there's really good emerging research identifying genes and the roles of environments which seem to have predictable consequences. So it's early stages yet, but I'm encouraged by this marriage of psychology, environment, and what might be the genetic basis. Because most genes are silent. Most of our genome is actually quite, is not signaling. So there must be some role of environment turning things on and off.
Can you give us any specifics that looking in the brain can add to our understanding, not only maybe of how we do things, but of how we might change the things that we do?
So possibly, I think the most relevant work would be on inhibition and frontal lobe function and how these are changing over the course of development. Sarah Blakemore has done excellent work on adolescent brains, showing that these don't reach maturity, lo and behold, until you become an adult. It's not too surprising. That's not the full explanation for teenagers' rebellion, but it's one interesting aspect of it. If you intervene through various manipulations, you can manipulate behavior, you can modify inhibitory control with very predictable outcomes. So that's an example where we have some understanding of the regulatory functions of what we call the executive functions that have tangible consequences for how you control your behaviors, which explains why people become antisocial when they become disinhibited. And we can all do that by having a stiff drink, because that's what alcohol is. It's depressant. It turns off the control of frontal lobes.
Although there has been some very interesting work done with placebo alcohol that shows that
Drinking
placebo alcohol, some of the audience really enjoying that. Have you taken part in these studies of placebo alcohol? You've done them on other people. There are some researchers at London South Bank University that ply their test subjects with placebo alcohol and observe very similar disinhibition techniques. You're going to rush off en masse and volunteer.
Well, context is always important, the way we behave, and that, of course, is part of what the book's about. The way that we act and behave and think is very much dependent on what we think other people think of us. And so context, social context, is a really important factor in that. I think a lot of that placebo would be due to that.
Marvellous. Okay, I'm going to stop hogging the conversation and come out to you, because we have a little under half an hour left. Now, I know we have some people... A placebo alcohol lady got your hand up already. We have some roving microphones, I believe. Yes, they're at the back, standing by ready to rush up the aisles. Can I ask you to wait till you get the microphone and then to speak into the end of it, partly for the benefit of the people watching the webcast at home. If you want to stand up so the people watching the webcast can see you as well, that's fine. Obviously, you may have not known this was being webcast. You may have pretended you were somewhere else with somebody else, in which case, stay sitting down, duck down, and talk this way with a disguised voice is my advice. If you're happy, Bruce, I'll take a couple of questions at a time, and then you can gather them up. So, lady at the aisle here in the lovely russet top, and then maybe we could bring the other microphone to here on the front row, and then I will come out and take everybody else, but we'll start with you.
I hope I'm not going to be tagged with that in future. I found it really interesting what you were saying, because I used to do Piaget, work with young children and babies, and maternal deprivation. I'm thinking in particular of Romanian orphans. And because I've got that sort of brain, it chimed immediately, because I heard this morning on the radio we're about to have a war on dementia, and I wonder if the isolation factor at either end of life kind of connects up with that. Because I know Michael Marmot's study on the, was it 2000? Civil servants, about if they were in control. It didn't matter how much the stress was. It was if they were the boss and in control, they got off on it. But if they were the underlings, it actually... Because you're talking about the health aspects, and I think they're really important, and the groups, so...
Well, you've managed to pack about 2 or 3 overlapping questions to that, so let's start with that one, and then we will come to you.
Yes, so the study of the Romanian orphans, they're now in their mid-20s. They've been followed up by Michael Rutter, Sir Michael Rutter, in this country, and followed up in Canada and the US. And the consensus is quite clear, that the longer children were in the orphanages, the more pronounced and detrimental their social interactions were. And this was typically informing enduring social relationships. So they were fine in terms of intelligence, and by the way, these children were fostered out to very nurturing homes. And despite that, the longer they were, it seemed to impair them permanently. Now, what is it about abnormal environments? What do social interactions give you? And I think what they give you is a sense of order and control, because it's the lack of control, and this relates to your last point, that people find stressful. And the way it may be working is that we deal with stress with the fight and flight response, or it's basically activation of hormones which enable us, prepare us for actions. Now, if you cannot predict when you need to fight or flight, you have to maintain high levels of reactivity, and that is believed to set your response into an abnormal mode. So an analysis of individuals who were basically evacuated during World War II, this is a recent Danish study, found that 60 years later, they could predict on the early circumstances of what kind of early social environment was, what their HPA, or hypothalamic pituitary adrenal system, was. In other words, the reactivity to stress had been set by their early experiences. So I think that's the mechanism. I think it's the way that we deal with uncertainty is being distributed or disturbed in early abusive relationships.
Hi. Sorry, is this on?
Yes.
First of all, thank you very much, Professor Hood. That was an incredibly enlightening talk, so thank you. I have two streams of questions, really. First of all, as I understand it, adverse childhood events, which are essentially incorporeal things, can change the brain in the corporeal way. I suppose that would be the armchair philosopher way of putting it. Is that the case, first of all?
Yes, so that's sort of what, following on from the first answer I gave, that what we think is that events require reactions towards them and dealing with them, and what a nurturing environment gives you is the level of certainty and predictability, and indeed the presence of someone who can help you, assist you, support you. In environments where the child is left alone or doesn't form an attached or predictable attached relationship, yes, it could be argued that they don't learn to adequately deal with the stressor response. And when you're overreacting your stress systems, then that means that you don't learn to adequately cope with stress in future. You might say, well, why is stress bad? Well, stress activates on the immune system. So, for example, the studies of people who have high reactivity show that their T lymphocytes, their ability to deal with infections are compromised. And indeed, this is also true for people who don't have social support, who live in isolation and who are alone. So it would appear that social interactions buffer and protect you or inoculate you to some extent, both by helping you to learn how to modulate your own stress response early on, and then later on in life by providing the support, which is the basis for a problem shared as a problem halved.
Thank you. And so, for example, if somebody's amygdala is reduced by 20% in size due to these events, and is it possible, for example, through intensive therapeutic intervention, to let's say, reverse the damage so that it goes back to a healthy size again, to put it very simplistically? I
would be surprised if you could. First of all, we have to be careful about talking about relative size of a particular structure like the amygdala. It's generally considered a subcortical structure, so it doesn't probably have the same, I don't know to be certain about this. It would be amazing if you could show structural changes in the amygdala through some
I'm thinking of one particular disorder, so it's probably quite niche, but is it in theory possible is it an irreversible damage that is done? during the early...
I'm not so sure. I think what therapies would offer you are alternative ways of coping. I mean, that's generally what I think therapies are very good at doing, is providing alternative strategies, behavioral strategies. If you think of cognitive behavioral therapies, they often don't necessarily get rid of what is an underlying problem, but provide you with a way of coping and dealing with things. So at some level, that must be encoded in the brain. It can't be encoded in your psychic soul or something like that.
Yeah, so I was thinking more of the mentalization-based therapy, which you mentioned earlier.
I'm going to move us on
Sorry,
now. I'm
yes.
just worried that we're going to spend the next half hour discussing
just debating
something
this. No, that's very interesting, and that's really, I just wanted your view on that.
In fact, would you like to pass the microphone to the gentleman behind you? In general, can I encourage you to focus on one specific question, and then if we have time, I'll come back to you for a second.
Yeah, hello. I was just interested in terms of looking at the location of various aspects in the brain. I just wonder whether you think that might be analogous with sort of big data, in that what one's getting is correlations rather than causation.
Yes, yes, absolutely. Guilty as charged. We can't really do, because we don't have the ethical, we can't go in and do the direct manipulation of these structures, but you're right. All of these things are based on accumulated data from imaging studies, accumulated data from localized lesions. You're right. These are correlational activations. And so we can't really say much more of that because we just don't do those experimental interventions. Occasionally, you might be able to do a drug intervention where you can turn off an area, or there might be a bit of, as I said, a localized lesion where, but again, it's never that clean. All brains are very different. Even those brains of identical twins are still different. And that's because of epigenetic processes. That events, no environments are absolutely identical, and therefore no brains are going to be absolutely identical. So this is a summation of vast numbers of studies and vast numbers of images. So yes, I accept that point. It's always going to be a degree of correlation. And
by uniting big data, brain science, and psychology, we've probably hit peak hot topic.
Yes.
Right here in the RSA. Okay, other hands. Who else had hands? Wow, loads of hands going up. And we're being encouraged to tweet. Have you got a question in from Twitter? Is that what it is? Sorry, I didn't realise. Why you're holding up your little... Tell us what the question is from Twitter.
Question from Twitter. How does the brain handle the switch to do digital communication when it's so used to human interaction?
Very good question. This is kind of you start to spring off on this at the end of the book.
I do at the end, and I only spend a couple of pages because it's pure speculation at the moment. We simply really do not know. There are basically two camps. There are people who think that we're headed to some sort of terrible nightmare scenario where we're going to be subsumed by some sort of singularity, or at least we're going to lose the ability to have meaningful social interactions. I'm not going to name names. Everyone knows who she is. But it seems unlikely. I think one thing about human brains is we're very adaptive. And so it is true. We are interacting in a way which is very different. And I think we will eventually come up with ways of interacting with each other. But yes, it is bizarre that we seek out validation from a lot of anonymous people on Twitter and on Facebook and all these sorts of things. And it's remarkably powerful how other people's responses to us, which are anonymous, still influence us. I mean, I still get a buzz when somebody retweets something or you get something liked. And given that 1.7 billion of us on the planet are on some form of social networking sites, then it's not something we should just ignore, but I'm a little bit more optimistic. I think that, for me, it's sharing information. And this is just another, I believe we're undergoing a major transition in our cultural evolution with this capacity to communicate with vast numbers. And a number of people are very fearful of that. But I'm much more optimistic because I think that we're facing kind of considerable problems on a global scale. And if we can do anything to increase the communication or get some consensus of opinion, that might be some way of trying to head off what I perceive as a terrible looming situation. So I'm more optimistic about it. And we simply do not know yet what these new technologies or ways of communication are actually going to do with the brain. But as I said, there's a lot of speculation and a lot of scaremongering out there at the moment.
So we hope you feel validated, anonymous Twitter person who tweeted that in, because Bruce has answered your question and we've all listened to it and nodded in affirmation. Okay, people in the room, where were those hands again? Could we maybe get one microphone down to the front and one at the back? and then we'll do a pincer movement, and then we'll come over here.
Based on your last slide, if you had to introduce one government policy related to that, what would it be?
I'm a great admirer of Esther Ranson's initiative last year. She introduced Silverline, because as I said, there's 7.7 million of us live alone in this country alone, and 6 million of those are over the age of 65. And her initiative is to provide, in a similar way that she set up Childline for vulnerable children. The Silverline is set up for vulnerable adults over the age of 65. And I think loneliness is grossly underappreciated as a negative event. And that's one thing that does worry me maybe about modern life. And certainly if you live in smaller communities out of the metropolises, you can see that there's much more social interaction, I perceive, going on. So I suppose it would be good to find ways of, I don't know, maybe facilitating social interactions. I'm sure you could think of some creative ways of doing so. But I mean, we do seek each other out. I mean, we come to meetings like this and we enjoy the company of others. But I think we need to be aware that it's not a trivial thing being alone. Oh, the other thing I would just point out is policies on prison. And our country isn't so bad. But again, to point fingers, the US currently has 25,000 inmates in solitary confinement. And that's the worst imprisonment record on the planet by far. And if you look at the testimony, for example, if you look at Nelson Mandela's autobiography, he said that the worst thing, the most inhumane thing you can do is put someone into solitary confinement. It's such an imperative to have social interaction that people will start forming conversations with inanimate objects. And anyone who's seen Castaway will remember Tom Hanks with the ball Wilson. And I think it's just wired into us to try and have some sort of form of social interaction. So I suppose the one policy, the one tangible thing I would suggest is maybe a reconsideration of how we isolate people and the negative consequences of it.
Thank you. And at the back?
Do we have memories or stories which we're born with in our brain? We haven't learned them, but we've all got them.
Well, okay.
Straight to the profound question.
Well, I would say not, though I would say I do think that we have brains which have the capacity to acquire concepts. So that's a sort of Kantian, for any philosopher, this is Immanuel Kant's position. Blank slates would never work because you could never learn anything without some innate structure or rules for things to look for. So yes, there is something built into brains through evolution which makes us pay attention and conceive in certain ways which I think are universal. But as to a more elaborated story, no. I would find that quite remarkable, but of course I can't know for certainty because having a conversation with an infant is really kind of hard. But yeah, I think that I disagree with the blank slate notion, but I'm not sure there's any sort of collective untold story that we're born with.
Do you think we're born with a predisposition towards structures of stories?
Oh, sure, yeah. Well, I think we're certainly born with predispositions towards structures. So, for example, even the human language is a structural pattern, and vision is full of structure. So that's what the brain is. It's a pattern processing system. But as to a narrative structure, I'd find that quite remarkable because one of the reasons, for example, we don't think people have very good autobiographical memories, I mentioned that earlier, is, well, first of all, long-term memories are typically stored in the hippocampus, and that's not very mature. But at a more functional level, I'm not sure children really understand what's going on all the time. Unless you can conceive of an event and understand what's going on, it's very difficult to know and remember it. And we know this is true because if you look at children raised in Eastern cultures, and they talk to their children differently than the way that we do, they will integrate their daily experiences in a much more elaborated framework. They have much better autobiographical memories than children raised in the West, where we typically don't talk to them in that sort of way. So, in other words, if you provide a conceptual framework to make sense of experiences, you will encode them as memories. So I would suggest that it's not simply a brain limitation in the 2-year-old. It's actually because they haven't got a way of thinking about their experiences in order to make them into meaningful stories that we remember as autobiographical memory.
Wow. So parents, in addition to all the other responsibilities you now have to go home and read screenwriting books before you talk to your infants. Okay, where are the other hands? So green sweater there, and then maybe you'd like to then pass the microphone straight across, and we'll see if we can field 2 questions at once.
Yes, when you mentioned the correlation between, at the end of the Ice Age, the brain size shrinking and domestication, which way do you think the causation works, and are there any semi-convincing arguments for the other causation pathway?
Okay.
You don't presumably mean that the shrinking brain caused the Ice Age to end? That's not what you mean, is it? No. Good. Yeah, sorry, carry on.
You mentioned in your talk, or suggested the idea that our ability to interact socially is contingent on developing a sense of self and identity.
Yes.
How much sympathy do you have with the contingency being the reverse? That our sense of self and identity is in some sense contingent on our ability to socially interact. The reason I asked, because there's some work, for example, that's suggesting that theory of mind was prior to developing an ability to introspect, or our ability to reason logically. System 2 reasoning evolved primarily to interact and for epistemic vigilance with others.
Yeah, okay. I might have to come back to you on the moment because I'm going to try and remember the first question. So the first question is, I don't know, to be honest, there's a number of suggestions of what are plausible mechanisms. So, for example, when the planet warms up, bodies get smaller. There's an inverse relationship between temperature and body size. So it might be something to do with that. There was a change in our diets, although that doesn't seem to be accepted by many. There's a number of potential explanations, and there's no agreed consensus. So, as I said earlier, I used that as a cunning ploy to bring the reader in to try and get the answer to why the brain's been shrinking. Frankly, to be honest, I really don't know why that is the case. I just think it's very, very interesting and worthy of pursuit. The relationship, that I agree with you entirely. There is a sense where identity is constructed by those around us. And so you're right. I did sort of suggest that you had to have the self almost a priori before you could have the interaction. I think that would be a little bit of an extreme claim because there is no self. That's my second book. The self is a changing story or a narrative which reflects the context of the people and the surroundings we're in. So, and I know we're probably going to argue now because Samandra wanted to really argue about, debate about whether there's a self or not. I happen to not believe in the self. So I agree with your point that actually it can be an emergent property out of the social context that we find ourselves in. So yes, I do agree with you.
But I can't argue with you because clearly if I don't have a self, I'm not here. And also, we don't have very long left and it would be unfair. So there were people over this side and I've been ignoring you. Were there? Well, no. Yes, sure there was a hand over this side. No, you've gone shy on me. Okay, there's a hand at the back then and one there. So we go over there and then to this one.
Has your research and thinking looked into how political identity or values are formed, and particularly thinking about Jonathan Haidt's work and the righteous mind? Have you gone into that?
Yes, I have, but I haven't done it in morality. So Jonathan Haidt's work is really on the role of type 1 intuitive thinking. This is thanks to Danny Kahneman, we now call it type 1, but it's this rapid, often unconscious attitudes that we seem to have that some things are right and some things are wrong. I do talk about a bit about it in the book, about morality and the appearance of morality, and I will defer to people like Kylie Hamlin and Paul Bloom at Yale, who have been studying the really early evidence that babies seem to know right and wrong, or at least they distinguish between right and wrong. In my own research, I haven't looked at morality, but I have looked at intuitive reasoning. But that is in the context of rapid decisions we make about how objects should behave, how they should move, the physics of the world. Psychologists in development are usually, they usually work in different areas. So they'll work in understanding the physical world, the biological world, or indeed the psychological world. For me, most of my research has been in understanding the physical world. But I would argue that it's the same sort of intuitive, unconscious, rapid processing systems that are operating. And I also added, you might want to read the first book, because that also addresses that, how these intuitions can form the basis of supernatural and magical thinking. So yes, I'm a great believer that there are different modes of thinking. Some are more, some are fast and rapid, and some are much more rational, if you want to call it that, or at least semantically related.
Since we're in brilliant seamless plug mode, I'd like to refer you to, I'm actually presenting a Radio 4 program about psychology, brain science and politics that's due out later this month, called Personality Politics. So if you're watching at home, Personality Politics, Radio 4, probably May the 20th, I'm not sure. Anyway, on with your event, Bruce. Who's got the microphone at the back?
Bruce, I read The Self-Illusion, which I thought was a wonderful book, and I've really enjoyed the talk. In the talk, you emphasised a lot of the sort of social construction ideas of cognition, which I have a lot of sympathy with. So I was quite surprised when you mentioned that you were a supporter of evolutionary psychology, because some view the two as inconsistent, not that they necessarily are. So I was wondering if you could, you've mentioned this a little bit, but I was wondering if you could sort of explain how the two relate to each other. So do you think we're born with certain instincts and sort of patterns that can be socially overridden, or what's the relationship?
It's exactly that. It's exactly that. We're born with, I think we're born with brains which are seeking out other brains, and we do so. We have a rudimentary system which is driven by emotion. It's driven by biases to attend to certain things. But the brain has a degree of plasticity in it, so that it is readily willing to accept the variation that you find in cultures. So to give another analogy, you remember I was talking about the visual system. The visual system, to some extent, is already pre-specified. It's like having your hard drive. It's formatted, okay? But what you actually end up encoding depends on the experiences. Now, I know people hate the computer metaphor, but I think in this situation it's true. If you look at the visual system, there is expectation to see movement, color, shape, and form. And you can measure that in animals and indeed infants before they've had any visual experiences. I would suggest that there's something similar happening in the social adaptations as well. And given that I think that the evolution has also been working on social behavior, then I don't see any inconsistency why that cannot also have a biological pre-adaptation to it as well. But yes, it has within it greater flexibility to adapt, because of course the social environment is changing within a lifetime, whereas the visual environment isn't generally. So that's why I think the visual environment shows much more profound critical period phenomenon. And I didn't say much about critical periods, but if you don't get exposure during this early period, then you lose that ability forever. Whereas social environments, of course, are much more fluid. Nevertheless, I still believe that there is an imperative to form some social relationship, acquire some of the social rules, but that's much open or more flexible over the course of the lifetime, because your social environment will keep shifting.
Thank you. There's a hand down there in the middle of this block. Anything else come in on Twitter? No.
One of the remarkable things in the last 10 years has been the emergence of things like Google and Facebook. What do you think of the commercial opportunities here? Complete disinterested question on my behalf. What do you think the business is going to make of all this, and where are the big companies going to arise? What sort of things are they going to be doing?
They're already doing it to some extent. So they're processing information about our preferences, and then they're then using that to filter information that we see and that we get exposed to. So they're shaping our consumer behavior. They're shaping our attitudes. And what I find interesting, because one would assume that with open access to large number of opinions, you might expect there to be a democracy of attitudes. But actually, there's good evidence suggesting that we're becoming increasingly polarized, because if you have enough, flat Earth believers out there, they can communicate with each other and form a community. And so what that can create is actually these groups of radical thinking. And of course, when you identify yourself as an extreme group, you only have to listen to each other, that you self-reinforce these ideas. So I suppose that is one of the negative possibilities, that access to a large number of radical beliefs can lead to polarization. Because once you've identified yourself as the flat Earth group, whatever, or whatever you might believe in, you tend to distance yourself further and further away from the general consensus. So that's probably one of the problems of having vast amounts of data. If you're only ever Googling flat Earth belief, then that's all you're ever going to see, because that's what the algorithms in the search engines will throw up. And for the commercial prospects, this big data is a gold mine, because they can figure out what the collective attitudes and buying power of what people are doing, and therefore then stream us towards one thing or the other. So it's not without any dangers. I just think we need to be aware of what's going on.
I think there was a hand down there. I didn't. Yes, lady right in the front row. And then I think we're rapidly running out of time. So if you're thinking about it, this is your last chance.
My question revolves around linguistic skills. Right. Are some of us born with a brain that is hardwired that enables us to be able to learn foreign languages? I have a relative whose little boy says, but I am not good at languages, and he's only 8, and I'm trying to convince him that he is good at everything.
Right. Well, yes, I mean, there is good evidence that language acquisition does have a very much a biological basis. It's converging evidence from a number of different fields. So there are selective impairments from various types of brain damage. There are genes which are associated with language. And then there's, of course, the problem of acquiring a second language. It's relatively easy if you're exposed to second languages. Well, put it this way, a baby will learn any language that it's exposed to if it's a typically developing baby. Doesn't matter if they're born to Japanese parents, if you raise them in England, they'll learn English. But acquiring a second language becomes progressively harder after the age of 7. So this is classic work demonstrating, looking at comparing immigrants and their offspring and the amount of exposure they've had. And it doesn't matter how much effort you put into it as an adult, it's just really difficult to acquire a second language. And the older you become, the more difficult it is. But if you are a very young child and you're exposed to languages, and the best way to do it if you've got bilingual parents is to have them consistently speak to the child in the different languages, then they will quite easily, mostly, acquire that. But again, there are also individual differences as well for language. I have no capacity for foreign language, and I've really, really tried. So I know it's not through effort. I really do believe there's something wrong with my brain, just makes me not so good at acquiring languages. So yes, I think there is a biological basis for language, and I think there's also individual variation as well. But yeah, it's obviously a combination of the biology working within the environments.
But bear in mind also the other thing you mentioned in the book, which is stereotype threat. I don't know if you use that term, which is if you expect to be doing badly at something, you do worse at it. So make him take a bogus test, tell him it proves that he's really good at languages, and his performance will probably improve. That's right, isn't it?
That's right, yeah, stereotype.
Let's hope he's not watching on the internet. Okay, we're pretty much out of time, unless there's any short burning questions. No. In that case, it's my duty to thank you all for coming, but to say that there will be a bookstall outside. So if you'd like to buy the book, which I do recommend, I think Bruce will be good enough to sign it. And if you have any questions you were too shy to ask in public and in front of the massed millions of the internet, you can whisper it in his ear as he signs your name. So please join me in thanking Bruce for a fantastic event, and great to see you.